Welcome back to Earth Station Trek, a show where we trek from the early days on NBC to the future on Paramount Plus and everywhere in between. I'm Charles Kelso, and it's my privilege to introduce the Earth Station Trek crew: Keith Johnson,
Greetings and felicitations.
Alan Seiler,
Praise be unto the prophets.
I should have
and
done that.
Veronica Dashel.
Hi.
And welcome back, everybody. And tonight we're going to be talking about religion in Star Trek. But first,
A little topic.
Keith, do we have some This Week in Trek this week?
We do. Couple of things that happened over the years during this time. The first one is just a personal one because there's a lot of Star Trek that has these little moments that become kind of iconic, and I think this is one of them. 1966, May the 5th, 1966, the outline was submitted to the producers for the original series episode Shore Leave.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which is a fun one.
Yeah.
For those that don't remember, Veronica, I don't know if you remember that one by name. That's the one where they went.
I don't know any of my name.
Okay, you'll know this one. This is the one where McCoy goes down to the planet and the rabbit from Alice in Wonderland shows up and says he's late. Yeah, that's the one. And what I do like about it's very interesting. Star Trek it's a goofy show in a lot of ways, but it's also interesting because it's a truly alien concept. Think of a world, we're not talking holodecks. Think of a world where you can go and literally be killed if you just think about something and they just bring you back to life. Mm-hmm. That's weird.
Yeah, the more complex the mind, the greater the need for the simplicity of play.
That's it. That's a good one. Yeah, I also like it because even though it's a stereotype, it has Finn. What was his name? The guy who was Kirk's tormentor.
Finnegan.
Finnegan, right. And for my Irish friends, I apologize. They had that goofy Irish music, but
he is no longer the worst Irish accent in Star Trek.
What would that be?
31 topped him.
Is that the Up the Long Ladder from TNG?
No, I was gonna say Section 31 now holds that mantle.
Oh, that's right, boy. Yeah, from the ridiculous to the sublime. I find this very interesting. Flash forward 2 or 3 generations, and May 5th, 2022 was the debut of One Strange New Worlds.
Hey.
Woohoo!
Yes. Yeah.
And we're waiting for we still don't have an actual date for when the public can see it, do we?
We had 20 episodes since then.
Yeah, I was checking today. It still has about an 8.3, 8.5 rating generally. So it is, I would say, inarguably considered the best of all it's the most consistently praised of all the new Star Trek, rivaled possibly by Lower Decks, yes. But it's the one that people most consistently love. It premiered with the episode Strange New Worlds.
Yeah, I would say it has the broadest appeal.
Yeah,
it's more easily digestible Star Trek than some of the other stuff they've done.
So I'm curious, do you happen to know what the rating for Lower Decks is then?
No, I want to say it was something like 7.6, but
boo. They're wrong.
Well, there'll be some people who just don't like comedy Star Trek.
Oh yeah.
They're wrong.
Yeah.
I'm curious, I'm looking it up.
Well, I think Charles is right, because once you get past Strange New Worlds, if you go to Picard, if you go to Discovery, if you go to Lower Decks, if you go to Prodigy, there are people who just hate the concept. There's some people who hate a Star Trek cartoon. Right. There's one guy I listen to on YouTube a lot, Steve Shives, his name. He does a lot of Star Trek stuff. He despises Lower Decks because he said it's just a bunch of ridiculous callbacks.
Right.
And end the story for him.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And there's another one, Veronica, for you. In 1996, I'm trying to do things that are kind of iconic and have memorable things. 1996, nobody expected this one to do what it did. May 6, 1996, the Voyager episode Tuvix aired.
Yay! Wearing my Tuvix shirt, though. I'm sad.
We're not going to debate Tuvix.
No.
Why you got to bring that up?
I know, right?
Show over.
That thing, I tell you, that thing just has so many legs. It's also probably one of the greatest ethical discussions in Star Trek history and Voyager. Who would have thunk it?
I love it.
Yeah. Well, more debuts. Let's fast forward one day, 7th of May, 2009. I think you know where we're going there. That was the debut in some locations, Star Trek 09. Even though it's officially listed as debuting on May 8th, it actually debuted at something like 7 p.m. in certain locations in the United States on May 7th and in Australia. I remember where I was when that was going on. I had just been laid off from my job of 10 years the year before. And so I was looking forward. It's one of those things you're looking forward to something. I remember going, I liked it. But of course, I was a little vaguely disappointed because it was the Kelvin universe. What did y'all think when you first saw it? Loved it?
I thought it was fun. I was glad to have
Yeah.
Star Trek back.
Yeah.
It wasn't everything I think a Star Trek could be, but Star Trek felt young and fresh and fun for the first time in a long time.
Right.
I remember that I saw it. However, at the time I was finishing up sitting in on classes because they had forced me to graduate from a 2-year college after 3.5 years. So I was kind of young and was definitely not as into Star Trek, but I feel like I saw it, but I don't remember it as most.
That was the
things.
year before we met. So you didn't
No,
know.
2009? I thought
Yeah.
you said 2007.
No, 2009 was the
2009.
year before we met. And so you didn't know how much Star Trek was coming your way.
That is true. I don't know what's happening in 2009. I may have not seen it then because I would have been super, super broke.
Yeah. It was, I enjoyed. How about you, Alan? Do you like it?
What she's saying is she married Charles for the money.
Sucker.
For those Federation credits.
That's funny. How about you, Alan? Do you like it?
I enjoyed it. It was
Yeah.
good. I loved it.
Yeah. I think Charles was right too. I thought it was fun. It was, and you know what's funny? My issues with that series has always been the whole existence of the Kelvin universe. But what the things that people talk about much, I noticed the lens flares and stuff like that did not really bump me all that much.
Right.
It was okay.
Yeah.
But other than that, I thought it was fine. Let's see. We got two more. 9th of May, 1988. Having watched TNG when it originally aired and as it came up, and being vaguely disappointed in the first season of TNG, which I thought was a little slow and boring, this episode came on and really kind of rocked things, and that was the episode Conspiracy.
Okay.
Yeah, that was. Do you
one.
remember that one, Veronica?
No.
I do.
Yeah.
I mean, if you described it to me, it'd probably be like, oh yeah, I remember that, but
the
I don't.
parasite things that take people over.
Oh.
It's a fun episode. When I was watching Star Trek, I used to watch it on VHS. My uncle had that season, and I used to skip that one because it sounded boring. And then I finally watched it because it was like a conspiracy at the highest levels of Starfleet. And I was like, no. But I finally watched it, and it's awesome.
It is great, and it did so many interesting things. It introduced Triala Scott, who was supposedly the youngest person to become captain in Starfleet history. It was also one of the most explicit or violent Star Treks because at the end, when they basically focused the phasers on Remic's head and literally blew it open, it was that cool special. And then they had that giant worm in his thorax. It was wild.
Okay, so the worm went into. Was it a worm type thing? It was a slug.
Like a little.
Yeah.
Did it have legs and tentacles and stuff?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. You remember that?
Did it go in their ear or did it like burrow into the back of its neck?
Goes in their mouth, and then a little gill comes out the back.
Yeah.
Okay, so more Goa'uld without the neck scar type. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking Yerks and Animorphs initially.
But the thing was, the queen was like as big as his entire chest cavity because when they blew it open, there was this huge queen monster in there and they killed it. And I love that episode because at the end, Picard said, after so many years of something like, trying to preserve life, what a shame we had to take it. And like, I don't know if you had to blow Remic's head open, but they did.
But it's satisfying.
Yes. And I'm sure as those know that creature was kind of sort of what they thought may bring back. Because you remember at the end, they said there was a signal that was being sent, and they had thought they might bring those worm creatures back to become an enemy, and then the Borg, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting thing.
I'm still waiting.
Yeah, same here. And that is this week in Trek history.
Awesome. Well, do we want to grab a couple of comments before we get into our topic?
We have some comments. First of all,
Cool.
Mark says that we missed you last week, Veronica.
Oh,
Yeah.
yay. And I'm on my second margarita, so I'm going to be extra entertaining tonight. You're
Oh
welcome.
dear. She's going to be extra Veronica. That's awesome. Elaine says this topic, religion and Star Trek, is rather fitting considering the new pope was selected today.
Yeah.
We totally planned it that way. We knew exactly when
We knew.
they were going to make their decision.
Yeah, Keith let the white smoke up, and we knew it was time to talk about religion and Star Trek.
That's right.
Oh my gosh.
And Elaine also says all of life needs comedy, and there is nothing wrong with laughing.
That
Indeed.
is true. And Finnegan is funny.
Matt Sweatman says, Keith, I just ate dinner. Why'd you have to bring that subject up?
I think
I'm
that
not
was
sure
in
which
relation to
subject
Star
he
Trek
meant.
2009.
Oh, good one. Not really
Elaine
head
says-
being blown open.
Elaine says she enjoyed the Star Trek movie 2009. She was pregnant with her son Carter, and it was the last movie she saw in theaters for a couple of years.
Wow.
Mark says, I was sure the Remick creature was the big bad in Picard season 3. Wouldn't that have been
Oh,
great?
That would have been amazing.
Rather
Yeah.
than trotting out the Borg yet again.
I never
That
thought of
would
that.
have been perfect.
Yeah, that would have been a good.
And Elaine says, I have some wine, so I'll be feeling Trek too. Veronica.
They're about to get religion.
Right.
All right. Yeah, right. All right.
Oh, it was Tuvix.
It was
Matt
Tuvix
Sweatman
that
said
Matt
nope.
was-
It was Tuvix that turned his stomach.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh,
Keith, I have a question before we move on. It's very
Uh-huh.
important.
Uh-huh.
Where did you get your rating from? Was it Rotten Tomatoes or IMDb?
IMDb for
Okay.
SNW.
I'm still looking that up.
okay.
Okay.
Keith, you suggested religion in Star Trek. Do you
Mhm.
so do you want to cue this up?
Yeah, I've always found it very interesting with Star Trek because I was actually rewatching the Orville recently, that other show, and there's an episode that talks a little bit about religion, and the captain makes a comment about this planet that has much religious thought, and he said it's interesting because most civilizations tend to lose their religious beliefs the more advanced they get. And I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at that.
It's the REM syndrome.
Yes, losing my religion. Yeah, one of my favorite songs of all time. And I span a lot of worlds, and then I work in technology. I read fantasy and stuff like that. But I was raised a pretty typical person from Texas in the 60s and 70s. My dad was a preacher. I was raised in the church, but my family was not very extreme Christians. Like we go to church and then the minister would tell us, I'm going to get you out of here in time to go watch the Dallas Cowboys play. So, and I still consider myself a believer, but my views are extremely liberal and open and all this kind of stuff. And I was thinking about what the Orville said. And then I was actually just thinking, well, gosh, how does Star Trek approach religion? Because most people would probably say Star Trek is anti-religious. And I don't know if you can say that. I don't know if it's anti-religious. It may be kind of agnostic toward it. And I was just thinking about that and thinking about Cisco and some things there. And I was just thinking, so just what does Star Trek say about religion in universe? And are they saying anything about the future of humanity and religion going forward?
Well, often in Star Trek,
Mhm.
if you meet God's going to turn out to be an insane computer or a petulant child or an alien imposter who's trying to deceive you.
Right.
I mean, that's usually your three options.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because science fiction in general tends to take that attitude toward religion, where a lot of times, and for anybody who has bought the Earth Station Trek Guide to Star Trek book, I wrote a chapter on religion.
Yes.
And a lot of times religion is used to show how primitive or how different a culture is from quote unquote us, whoever the us might happen to be in whichever. And in Star Trek, it's the Federation, which is basically humanity. And all the people who are part of the Federation are some aspect of humanity. And religion can a lot of times be used to show either a limited belief or a limited understanding of the universe or how alien they truly are. And that's one of the things that I am so fascinated by in Star Trek, because in Star Trek, they do that sometimes. But there's a wide range of representations of religion in Star Trek. And one of the things that I'm really drawn to is, we mentioned this many, many times. People griped about DS9 at the beginning because it was stationary and Strange New Worlds had to come to us rather than us going out and, all that stuff.
Right.
But being stationary for over the period of 7 years means that you are developing your understanding of a certain culture. And in this case, it was the Bajorans. And we got to see really deep understanding and layers of their religious beliefs. And what I really found fascinating was that, yes, this is another case of their belief really being in an alien entity and not in a quote unquote God. And yet, for the 7 years that we watched that show, there was never a time when one supplanted the other. There were people who wanted to make that case, like Kai Wynn, or at the time she was Vedic Wynn.
Right.
Who, one of my favorite things that DS9 ever did was the very last episode of season 1, where they basically did a creationism versus science episode. And they bombed the school on the station because the station was teaching that these are wormhole aliens. They're not a deity. And I just find that really fascinating. And over 7 years of DS9, the Bajorans continue to worship their gods in the face of overwhelming evidence that they are transtemporal beings that exist in the wormhole. And I just find those two things living together and intermeshing together to be super fascinating. That was long and rambling. I'm very sorry.
Well, the interesting thing is that in Star Trek, like humanity could have wound up like the Bajorans, because we had aliens that were visiting us, and Paulo's people were hanging out on Earth in our ancient times. We were worshiping them as gods. We got kind of lucky that they buggered off and didn't bother us anymore. But I mean, if Apollo's people had hung around on Earth, we could have wound up like the Bajorans worshiping these aliens, which is something that Star Trek doesn't really go into that much. But I mean, we certainly had alien visitors, masquerading as gods on Earth. But the difference with the Bajorans is the aliens just hung around.
Out of sight, also.
Right.
Yeah.
So they were more like gods to them because they were like omnipotent, basically.
But what's
they weren't
interesting,
part of them.
Yeah. But how did the Bajorans become aware of them? Did the wormhole beings like intervene in Bajoran culture or history or something like that? Were there things that led the Bajorans to an awareness of or an understanding of the transtemporal beings?
I mean, if nothing else, they gave them the orbs.
Yeah, that's what
Well, that's true. That's true.
They were called.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the Bajoran like prophecies and scriptures and things came through their orb experiences. I don't know how much that the prophets were hanging out on Bajor, but the Pa Wraiths were, because you go to the fire caves and there's Pa Wraiths.
That's true.
In the fire caves.
Yeah, you can stumble in there and get one.
Every good religion has to have a heaven and it has to have a hell.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So I think something you said interesting, Charles, about the Apollo and them, because they, one of the things that is so, there's a couple of things. One of the things that's so interesting about many religious beliefs is that the gods almost literally feed off of worship, with some noble exceptions, which tend to be, well, I'm not going to call them the big three, but three of the biggest: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. God does not feed off of worship like that. But, Apollo said that when they,
okay.
Yeah. What I mean is,
how many of the 10 Commandments are about respecting God?
Yeah. But what I mean is,
how few of them are about like hurting women.
Right. But I mean is in Christianity, if we stop believing in God, God will still exist and not get weaker.
I don't know if that's true, man, because so much of the Bible is about God wanting to be worshipped.
Yeah.
and if you fail to do so, you just go to hell.
Yeah, but what I mean is, if we stop believing in God, God's strength won't go away. At least that's not the way Christianity teaches it. But what I find interesting is in the original series, Apollo told Kirk, he said, we need worship even as you need food. And so when you mention how we got lucky because of the Greeks, I tend to think what happened was Christianity came forward and humans turned to Christianity, and we know what happened in real life. And I think those gods couldn't compete with Christianity, so they left the planet. And then, of course, comes Christianity. First Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and then the other things like Buddhism and Hinduism and stuff like that. And I find one of the interesting things you also, Alan, when you said about the wormhole aliens, is there's a really weird perspective when you have a discussion about religion, especially from a Western point of view, which, like what I just was saying with Charles, the God we were raised to believe in does not die and cannot die. And in certain faiths is the only God, period, end of story. No other gods, big G. But in many other religions, like ancient Egyptian mythology and Greek mythology and stuff, there were gods, but they could die. The God I was raised to believe in cannot die. Zeus could be killed and sent to Tartarus. And so,
right. I think at the same time, though, even in like Christianity, which is purportedly there's one God, there's a Trinity. So they try to have their cake and eat it too. There's actually 3 gods, but it's just the one God.
Yep.
One of them did die one time, but he got better. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
but a lot of that's
he was in
because a
physical
lot of
body.
Christianity is just repeating older religions, and they're just telling the same stories again.
And updated. Yeah, many of the other religions would, like, for example, if you look at the old Greek mythologies, when Typhon, the god that was created by Gaia and Tartarus, when Typhon came, the gods freaked out. They literally bugged out. Well, they went to Egypt, and then there's Egyptian gods, and so there was but Christianity especially tends to not allow. There are no other gods. You know, everything else is a false god. What I find interesting in Star Trek. So when you go to something like the wormhole aliens, to the Bajorans, it's like, fine, those are our gods. And I think what you were saying, Alan, is very interesting because they are aliens. They may be trans-temporal, but they're aliens. And we would just look at them and go, they can't be gods because they're not the ultimate God. But that's not always the definition of a God. And, you know, it is for Christians, but it's not for other things. And that also allows people on a planet to worship gods that are their gods, and that there could be gods in this part of the galaxy and gods in this part of the galaxy. But in some religions, no, there is no other. There's just the one.
Okay.
And I find that very interesting.
So to Bajorans, the wormhole aliens, because they live on another plane, are gods. That make the Qs gods?
I bet you they were worshipped somewhere in the universe as gods.
I would be shocked if they weren't, because I know the Q that we're familiar with would just love it. He would manipulate that.
Absolutely.
Well, he was pulling that in Tapestry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like when Picard died, he was like, I am God. And he's like, I refuse to believe the universe is so poorly put together. But I mean, the Q are basically our gods. And and there's a lot of, it's a recurrent thing in science fiction and Star Trek as well, that somebody with greater technology will show up at a planet and play God. Because it's tempting to do so. You know, you show up there and they're gonna think you're a god because you have these amazing powers.
Except for the example of Ardra, who had advanced technology but showed up and played the devil.
Which is way more fun.
Yeah. I never even thought about it like that.
Let me get a few comments. Mark reminds us of the sun, S-O-N, worshippers in bread and circuses, and there were no aliens based behind that religion.
Yeah.
Erica, who just joined a few minutes ago,
hey Erica,
says, what does God need with a starship?
Yeah.
Which is the title of my chapter in our book. And the founders of Odo's people are considered gods. Absolutely. And what's interesting about that is that they essentially genetically engineered their followers. They programmed.
They literally created them.
Yep.
So in literal terms of what people think of as religion.
The Vorta, like the Vorta, the storyline of the Vorta was that they're this arboreal aliens that were genetically enhanced or changed by the founders.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, again, advanced science, but it seems godlike.
So does that mean that's how humans were created, as some higher creature decided to come along and create this crazy race and then just left us to our own devices?
Well, we know that the progenitors sort of seeded life in the galaxy.
True.
You know,
right.
But I mean, ultimately, they, you know, when Burnham found them, they were like, no, actually, we didn't create this technology. We found it ourselves. You know,
exactly.
Which I think is interesting because it sort of extends the Star Trek backstory.
Right.
But I mean, talking about the founders, we talked about this when we talked about the what if in Star Trek thing. There's an interesting juxtaposition between the prophets and the founders, because you have two prominent religions essentially going at it in the Star Trek universe. And, you know, Cisco was obviously a big part of the Bajoran religion, which took him some time to get accustomed to. But I think it's interesting that the antagonists they created for them, the founders, were sort of a mirror image of that, where they also had their own gods and their own worship, you know, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. I find that the thing you mentioned, Veronica, about them being genetically created, because to cross the streams a little bit in Babylon 5, it turns out the Vorlons had done that to many races, where they had genetically programmed people to see them as deities. Remember, every race saw their version of an angel when Kosh took his encounter suit off. And so almost if you want to think this way, that would give some people the idea to think that religion is kind of basically a con game, frankly. For some people.
Really? I'm shocked.
Yeah, I would say, like, I mean, I grew up religious. I grew up Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
And in my teenage years, I spent actually 16 to 19 studying to be a minister. I used to speak at churches and teach at youth camps and things like
I
that.
did not know
right?
this.
Oh, I didn't either.
Wow.
Before
we
I
need to
became
have
an
a
atheist.
conversation.
When I was 19, I became an atheist, and I've been an atheist now for 25 years.
Really? Fascinating.
Studying religion turned him.
So I have my own opinions about a religion being a con game, because I mean, I think in a lot of cases it is, and it's something that it came up when we talked about the film The Man from Earth, and essentially it was, you know, he had a man who had lived the entirety of human existence, right? He just never died. He's 14,000 years old, and he remembers when people would look up at the sky and be scared because they don't understand why there's lightning or why there's snowfall or whatever. And eventually, he said, there were people who stood up and said, "I know the reason," and they used that to get power. And I think that's as far as humanity goes, a lot of the origins of religion, even to this day, is controlling the masses through by claiming you have a greater understanding. But I think we see that a lot in science fiction for that reason. Yeah. And I mean, I've always liked the Who Watches the Watchers interpretation, where humanity has sort of grown out of it. Like we have, we follow science. You know, we want to find evidence. We want to understand things. We don't want to accept things on faith. But I think that, I mean, obviously Deep Space Nine presented a different version of that with the Bajorans. And I mean, I think Kira is probably the most prominent religious person we've had as a Star Trek character.
Ever.
Yeah.
To date.
She was unfazed by the fact that she found out that her gods were aliens that live in that wormhole. I think something I would have liked to have seen on DS9, and maybe missed opportunity, is for Bajorans to find out, like, oh yeah, our gods are aliens that live in that wormhole. Like, is it real? You know what I mean? Because so much of the Bajoran religion, like their faith, like they got through the occupation by relying on their faith. You know, it's like the old you know, it's like trying to convert somebody who's in prison, who like God's all they've got. Like their faith is all they have to hang on to. The Bajorans, for a long time, their faith was all they had to hang on to. I would have liked to have seen more of a crisis of faith for the Bajorans as a technologically advanced and scientific culture, to like, oh crap, I've been worshiping that wormhole alien this whole time.
Conversely, what I would really like to see is a human character who follows some human religion, ideally Christianity, who is in Starfleet and has no dichotomy in their own mind. There is science and there is God. Because for me, I kind of see it like it's not a either or a versus kind of thing. To me, it's not like science is there to disprove God. Science is there to explain God's process. It's our way of discovering how the universe works, and I don't really see it in a antagonistic way. And I would love to see a Starfleet officer who is a believer, because I think that would be a really interesting angle that's never been really done before. Okay, I've got a series of comments here that I want to get to. Erica asks, are vampires gods?
Well, again, it's funny, in the tradition in which I was raised, in which there is only one God, no. But for some other people, they could be gods. We would say with a little g. They absolutely could be. Absolutely.
But they literally can't survive without human blood.
Right. But going back to the Greek gods literally couldn't survive without the golden apples, or the Norse gods. And
which didn't require humans to die.
Right. And ambrosia. So again, to me, those are lower G gods. So I could see vampires being considered as gods by some races, some people.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions or comments from Michael Pillar. I'm sorry, Michael Pillar.
Oh, really? Wow.
We have really stepped up our game if Michael Pillar is watching this.
I know, right?
Michael Phillips first says, somewhat related, I've always liked and admired the idea that the odd-numbered Trek movies have some kind of spiritual theme.
Never thought about that.
That's true. And I've never really thought about that before.
Yeah.
the even numbered ones are tend to be the less good ones, so maybe that's got something to do with it.
And the even number ones tend to be the good ones.
What? No, the odd numbered ones. I said it backwards.
Okay.
I was like, the
Okay.
heck you talking about?
And then Michael says, don't know if we've talked about it already, but obviously some kind of soul exists in the Star Trek universe because Vulcans have Katras. So something does survive. And there was also that Voyager episode where Harry Kim, they interact basically with another culture's afterlife.
Yeah,
I love that episode so much. It's one of my favorites.
I mean, any body swap episode indicates there's some kind of spirit.
Yes.
You know what I mean? If your spirit can come out of you and go into a different body, then you're not just your biology.
Exactly.
I don't know how much the books are considered canon, but the book Spock's World, I think Spock's World, the one that dealt with T'Pau. In that book, Spock told McCoy that Vulcans knew there was a God because basically they, being Vulcans, they meditated and stuff. They were more in tune with the greater universe, and they knew there was a higher plane of existence than humans did. And McCoy was stunned because these incredibly logical and advanced people actually believed in a higher power. And Spock's like, no conflict here. It's just how the universe works.
Well, in Star Trek, it is how the universe works because there are other planes of existence and higher beings and things like that. Like you really can ascend to a higher plane of existence in Star Trek. You can become an energy being.
Giant koala.
There is a giant koala.
I think it's funny. I think Alan says something that I feel the same way. One of my favorite episodes of Star Trek, period, is Who Watches the Watchers. I adore that episode. But actually, Alan, it's funny. In my notes I took, I love it, and I agree with their take. We've had the Inquisition, we've had burnings on the cross, we've had Salem witch trials. But it's funny you said that because I also said I would have loved to have seen a treatment of Who Watches the Watchers where believing in a god or a deity wasn't treated the way. Because remember when that scientist told Picard, he was like, "Hey, look, they already think you're a guy. Why don't you go down and give them some commandments?" And Picard lost his mind. He did. Not only did he say it was wrong, he instantly started saying, "If you don't give them guidance, there's going to be inquisitions and this and that." Now, human history has absolutely shown that religion will take you down that path, but it doesn't have to take you down that path. And Charles's look on Charles's face is like, "Yeah, right."
It doesn't have to, but it always does.
But that's humans' fault, not religion's fault.
Yeah.
I feel like that's living beings' faults.
Yeah, I mean,
not humans necessarily.
Right, but I mean, humans came up with religions, so it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But I mean, Erica Laurie makes a good comment there. The bad you became a god because
I was just about to get that.
You have a synthetic life form that was created by a member of the crew, and as often happens in Star Trek, by accident created a sentient being that you would think that there would be some sort of safeguard, because that happens a lot in Star Trek that you accidentally create life on the holodeck, and then are you their god? You know what I mean? And are we a holodeck? Someone accidentally said the wrong thing and created the sentient life forms.
Well, Erica makes a really good point, which we're all saying, which is your definition of a god depends on you. Because if you think about it, Kirk says, I remember in, and also this was really radical for the 60s, and one of my favorite episodes, Who Mourns for Adonais, when McCoy says Scotty doesn't believe in gods. That was a big deal in the 60s for a TV show to simply say somebody didn't believe in gods. And Kirk goes, Apollo's no god. End of story. However, in Deep Space Nine, as you guys are saying, the wormhole aliens are considered gods to the Bajorans, but to other people they aren't. And I remember there was an episode of Deep Space Nine, I can't remember the one. It was one, remember where Wei-Yun was talking to maybe Gul Dukat, and he was chuckling at how the Bajorans believed that the wormhole aliens were gods. And he turned to him and he says, "Well, you believe the founders are gods?" And Wei-Yun gets he was outraged. They are gods.
Right.
Isn't that great?
I love
Obviously.
that.
Yeah.
Right.
And Keith, when you were saying who mourns for, I immediately for mourned.
Right.
Oh,
Where you're going. I was like,
Of
that's
course.
your favorite episode?
yeah.
It can be. It's got to be somebody's favorite episode.
I love
a
that
fun
episode.
It's a good episode. I'm
Right.
just
Oh, it's a
like, Keith, really?
But no, the title was a
Oh, I
reference
do like
to
that
Who Mourns-
episode though.
Yeah, the title was a reference for Who Mourns for Adonai from the original series.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Matt says that both in Trek and in real life, he likes, if faith in a higher being is sincere, what better way to learn about God than through science examining the creation?
Sure.
I agree.
Okay, Michael Phillips says, in my own fictional work, I made the gods aliens who had ascended to a higher plane of existence beyond time, so they could influence or intervene in the universe at virtually any moment in time.
Okay.
So you're playing The Sims.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of, like I said, there's a lot of aliens in Star Trek, like the Organians or the Q, who are on higher planes of existence. I mean, I mean, in real life, if there were aliens that could manipulate time and space and control the universe and wanted me to do what they want, I would probably do that. You know what I mean? Because what's the difference? You might as well be a god if you really have those powers. But I mean, the thing in Star Trek is that, like, we have the ability to understand what they are. You know what I mean? And so for me, it's sort of naive for like the Bajorans. They believe in God. They believe in the prophets as gods. But I think largely it's because of their culture and what they've gone through. You know, it's you know, it's like trying to explain to like a parent who's lost a child who believes their child's in heaven. I would have no desire to go dissuade them from that notion, right? Because that notion is getting you through life. And the Bajorans are very much like that. But I mean, in Star Trek, though, we have the ability to understand what these gods are and to challenge them. And I think, you know, people mock Star Trek 5 a lot, but I love that scene in Star Trek 5 when there's this godlike being and everyone's revering them, who wants the starship, and Kirk steps up and he's like, I got a question.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's a good question. And you know, and no one else in the group until he says that thinks to ask the question. But surely, like, you know, if a god needs the starship, then it's not a god, right? And similarly, if the god needs a sacrifice or needs worship or needs XYZ, it's not a god. You know what I mean?
Unless
so
it's a little G god.
But I think it's a good thing for Star Trek to challenge because you know, it's something that crops up in our own fiction and our own religion and our own mythologies throughout our history. So to imagine ourselves sort of being at a stage where we could stand up and challenge that realistically, I think is good. I think it's a good thing to examine.
Right. That kind of brings to mind, again, that Voyager episode that I was talking about where Harry Kim becomes, for lack of a better word, part of another culture's afterlife. And they find a girl who had died and who had transported to their death planet, whatever it was. And they revive her because she died of an easily fixable, for us, easily fixable situation.
Right.
And it causes her this great, you know, crisis of faith because is everything I believed a lie? But they found evidence of some unexplainable energy emanating from that planet, which it could have just as well be a soul of, you know, the people who are there. And so Janeway says something like, just because I don't have an answer for you doesn't mean that there isn't an answer. And I think that's kind of the crux of this whole thing, you know. And so Clarence, our good buddy Clarence of the Discussing Trek and Discussing Who podcasts, says Pike had a great moment in Disco season 2 speaking about religion, and that is that his father taught comparative religion. And that is from the second episode of season 2, New Eden, one of my very favorite episodes because it deals with all these issues from so many different angles. And it's about a transported culture that has taken all these different beliefs and literally copied and pasted them into one big document. And that's their belief structure. They have taken things from Judaism and Christianity and Sikhism and all these different things and found what works for them. And that's their belief. And I think that's a fascinating idea.
And I think it's historically relevant too, because a lot of the religions as we know them today sort of began that way.
Sure.
Different cultures intermingling, and there's a bits of this and bits of Egyptian and bits of whatever else all mixing together into different religions.
Well, yeah. I mean, our whole understanding of Christmas is very, very much a lot of it is rooted in other traditions,
Yeah.
Right.
other more
Yeah.
natural
And
religions.
every religion has a flood myth that we know goes
Right.
way back before what we call Christianity started.
Right.
Alan, I think what you said was so funny. That was absolutely the crux of Star Trek, because that's what I wrote in my notes, which is Star Trek has never said that religion is or isn't wrong. They've never overtly said religion is wrong, and they've never said they're quote unquote is a god. And it's funny you said that, because I remember I was thinking about the same thing that Janeway said. And when Picard was asked one time, they always kind of say, there's just things we don't know. But they never say what the Orville said, which was, again, as a society becomes more advanced, they tend to stop believing. All the Star Trek captains go, we don't know.
Well,
now, Kirk believed, but that was the 60s.
yeah. I mean, there are times when they've gone one way or the other. Like,
Yes.
I mean, at the end of Bread and Circuses, when it was like the Son of God, wow, to see it all again, where it feels very pro-Christian. But then you have like Who Watches the Watchers, where it's like, these people have evolved beyond religion. We can't let them go back into savagery.
Yeah, he was very intense about that. And then you have
Right.
Worf, who is very religious, even though they said Klingons killed their gods, but
because they were more trouble than they were worth.
It's true.
Although Feklar might still be around, their devil. Was it
Right,
Feklar?
but the Klingons also have that weird thing with the Herc they've referenced a couple of times.
Yeah.
Where it could be that there were aliens posing as God on Kronos thousands of years ago or whatever that they killed. That they may have literally killed.
Clarence says something very interesting I didn't even think about when I was studying for this a couple of days ago. I came across something I had never known, and there was a whole bunch of treatises that said Captain Pike is a man of faith, and it never crossed my mind to even think of that. But that's what I read from a lot of sources. That's what they kind of think of him in the background. Never knew that.
Well, they mentioned that the first few episodes of Discovery season 2. Then there was a change of showrunners, and they dropped the whole religion versus science thing. But I think it's a good pull from the original series, because in The Cage, you get very limited information about Pike. But one of the things you get is this image of hell that the keeper pulled from his mind.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good thing, you know, that sort of segueing that into this sort of religious upbringing, I think works. But also I love that the keeper said something along the lines of like, from a myth you heard us in childhood. It is like something from like the major religion of America at the time. Or no, it was like from a fable you once heard in childhood.
Or as a child,
Right.
Yes.
Okay, comments, because we got a lot of them.
Okay.
Cool.
Erica says that I'm atheist, but I like to think our universe is the marbles from Men in Black.
I think we're on a cat's collar.
We have a kitten called Orion now.
Right.
Oh,
Just saying.
Nice.
Elaine suggests that the progenitors should be considered gods.
And probably are to some people somewhere.
Whoever gave the progenitor, created the progenitor's technology.
Yes.
Gods.
No, I like that we met the progenitors and they were just people.
Yeah. I wonder if she intentionally used a lowercase g when she typed gods.
I don't know. True.
Could just be the way her thumbs were working on her phone. I don't know. Erica says, does Chakotay believe in gods? And are the aliens that he met his gods?
I referenced Chakotay because and now we get into the religious versus spiritual.
Yeah.
He's definitely spiritual. Whether he believes in quote unquote gods, don't know, but he definitely believes in something outside of our existence. I tend to think he believes in an afterlife. So I don't know if he believes in gods, but he definitely believes in spirituality.
In spirit.
In spirit.
Yeah.
Erica says in Lower Decks they showed someone wearing a hijab, which
Good call.
I've always loved, and I wish that they had featured that character in something other than just
giving
walking
them a
through
name.
the background. Yeah,
we also got like background characters like wearing a turban and things like that. We never found out if it's like a cultural thing or if it's a religious thing.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right. I would love to have learned more about either one of those characters.
Right.
And then finally, Elaine says that she was always fascinated by that scene in Men in Black. Okay. We're caught up.
What I was also thinking about is I was actually wondering who would be the quote most either spiritual or religious captain. Now, Captain Kirk obviously believed in a God because, again, it was the 60s. It's not like he was religious, but he talked about God and Jesus, like you said in Bread and Circuses. I thought it was very interesting, especially for a Black person from the South, was in Deep Space Nine. There was an episode when Sisko was talking to his father, and he quoted from the Bible, And it was very interesting. Cisco said, now again, for me being a black man raised the way I was raised with a father's a preacher, this was really weird. Cisco says, Dad, I don't think I've ever heard you quote from the Bible before. Now, growing up when I did, and probably you too, Alan, I don't think I knew anybody who never quoted the Bible, even if they never set foot in the church. I thought that was very fascinating that they put that in there. But then, as you say later on, what does Cisco do? There's a whole episode, not too many spoilers, Elaine. He risked his son's life for kind of a belief. And I won't go too deep into that. So, very interesting. Yeah.
Right.
And remember toward the end, even Emma Ross.
Hey, look, I remember Star Trek episodes.
There you go. Yeah. And remember, even Emma Ross, they were kind of like, Ben Command is getting a little weirded out by you because it was like you were, and even Dax was kind of like, you were playing the role kind of at first, but you seem like you're kind of starting to buy this thing. And I think Dax even commented that he had stopped calling them the wormhole aliens. Ben started calling them the prophets. Yeah. That's a kind of faith.
Yeah, and he has an interesting arc over the course of the series because at first he's very uncomfortable with these aliens thinking that they're part of his religion, but then you see him sort of embracing his role as the emissary, and then by the end he's like, fighting Dukat in the gates of hell. You know what I mean?
Right, and part of that is more or less just symbolic of his embrace of the Bajoran culture, because he really started to think of that as his home, and he was planning on he and Cassidy building a life, starting a family, building a house on Bajor. So he had really become very connected to the people and the culture. But the journey that he has of being cast in the role of a religious figure and resisting it at first and then learning to become comfortable with it is super fascinating to me.
Right.
Clarence now says, I think it has to be Cisco embracing his role as emissary, albeit reluctantly.
Yeah, I'd say the most overt one. And I'm also getting fascinated because it was almost de facto with the original series. In the 60s, you pretty much had to, if you're going to do it, you kind of had to acknowledge there was a religion. Because if you think about the original series, to my knowledge, is the only one where there was a chapel even mentioned, because there was a chapel in Balance of Terror when the young lady was supposed to get married. She's in the chapel praying at the end. They reference Christmas. I mean, I know Christmas is, it's a religious holiday. It doesn't have to be, but it is. They reference Christian there. And then there's many times and I have heard that in Who Mourns for Adonais, when Apollo says, I'm your God, and Kirk says, we find the one quite sufficient.
Right.
I always interpret that as Kirk saying, we believe in one God. Some people said that was actually Gene Roddenberry trying to slip a little thing in where Kirk was kind of saying, one is enough. We are basically we already got one we can handle. I don't know which way it is. I've heard both sides being told.
No, I think that's wishful thinking on somebody's part. I think the implication there is that it's the Christian God. But at the same time with Kirk, like if God shows up, he better be able to prove it. You know what I mean? Because Kirk isn't going to accept it on faith. Because when we do have someone showing up later claiming to be God and everyone is accepting it, Kirk is the one who's skeptical. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's the uniqueness. Well, I'm not going to say the uniqueness, but that's one thing that, again, is so central to the three of the great religions. Christianity. Well, I'll get them in order. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is because they basically kind of say, especially Christianity, they just say there's one God in the story, and everything else you ever find anywhere in the universe, it's a little g. It's just a being. And that's kind of, I remember having these conversations with my parents when I talk about, other religions, and my mom would say, those aren't real. And I said, well, what about blah, blah, blah? And basically she's like, no, that's not real. There's only one God. So everything else that ever existed is little g God. There's only one, and that one can't die. And what I like with Star Trek is, you can have God here, more like, again, Greek mythology and Egyptian mythology, Japanese mythology. You can have one everywhere. And so I think, Alan, you said something very interesting because I'm getting personal over here. I had a friend who is another friend of mine who's an atheist, and I had two friends who are atheists, and they spent years trying to convince me there's no God. And since I'm an astronomer, I'm an amateur astronomer, and I study cosmology and stuff, and they're like, how can you believe in this? And I said this, and this is what I think Star Trek gets with. And I told my friend one day, I said, so you convinced me there's no God. I said, let's say you do that. What did you really win? Are you happy because I now have nothing that I can go to if somebody in my family has a terminal disease? I said, are you happy that I can't pray to somebody at night? I'm obviously not a fanatic. I was like, what are you accomplishing in that case? Because I'm not that guy. And he just kind of looked at me and goes, I never thought about it. He's like, you're not one of those Bible thumpers. But I'm like, I still believe Now I'm extremely liberal, and I've incorporated a bunch of Eastern thought into mine. My brothers think I'm a heathen, frankly. But yeah, but belief gives you comfort, and sometimes that's all it is. I don't tell anybody what to do, but then like I think Alan again says something I thought was so awesome with like when Picard and them, like religion always takes you to inquisitions and hangings and burnings, and frankly, as Charles said, is true. That's happened, God, throughout all of human history.
I mean, it's happening now.
Yeah, I was gonna right now as we speak in Oklahoma. The superintendent of Oklahoma schools is basically forcing religion in the schools, and he's forcing Christianity. He says teachers must display the 10 Commandments, they must have a Bible, and they must teach religious things. I find that appalling. I mean, appalling.
Like Kai Wynn is out there.
And you know what? I think and I'm going on. Kai Wynn, Vedic Wynn, and Kai Wynn is one of the most interesting figures in Star Trek, because we had a conversation one time. And I think Veronica, you said, I hope you don't mind me calling you out. I said, did we believe that Kai Wynn ever had real faith? And Veronica, I think you said no. And I think Alan and I kind of said she does, and she's also evil. And you can actually have that mixture. I think she really did have faith. I also think she was an opportunist and kind of evil. I think you can have both.
Yeah.
Which is the weird thing about religion.
Right.
There you go.
That's not weird. That's totally normal.
Okay, one more comment from Clarence. Says, I always found it interesting how shows like Battlestar Galactica embraced multiple gods.
Yes. Yeah. Again, crossing the streams and piggybacking on that, Clarence, in Babylon 5, there's an awesome episode where they were talking about religion, and I think it was Commander Sinclair. I think it was still the first commander, and he was trying to. All the aliens were talking about the religious beliefs, and he was saying, "Well, I don't really know. Not that there wasn't any." And what I loved about, he was trying to, because all the other races have kind of like one belief. And I love it because at the end of the episode, and he's introducing Delenn and all these other ambassadors, there's a line out the door. And he's like, here's so-and-so from Christianity. Here's so-and-so who's a Catholic. And then there was a rabbi. And then there was somebody from Islam. And then there was a Shinto. And it was just a whole line, because his answer to all the other races was, there is no one religion on earth. There's just a whole bunch of different beliefs.
Right. Yeah. Even as an atheist, I'll say that in the Star Trek universe, it should be more complicated, because they really are just bumping into like godlike beings all the time. So there should be people arguing like, no, the Organians are the true gods. No, the Q are the true gods. You know what I mean? Like there should be like sort of quasi religions and things popping up. And I mean, I would like to think that people have grown to an intellectual level where they understand these things. But I mean, just realistically, people being people, whether they're humans or not in Star Trek, you would think that there would be Bajorans who are saying like, no, I heard the Q are the real gods. You know, that when you really do have godlike beings who can exert that kind of influence, there would be people who follow them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I believe in the Stargate version.
Just blow them up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one of the things when Alan mentioned Audra that made me think of something very interesting. A lot of times Star Trek and other sci-fi does too, is they often tend to have, Christian gods, the gods of Christianity and Judaism, and really even Islam, despite some of the things that happens, are gods of peace and love. And a lot of times Star Trek and a lot of sci-fi, their gods are kind of like battle gods. There's that god who Charles will say that's all religion, right? But there are gods who are sometimes gods of war and conquest. That's
why I watch the news.
So, yeah. So a question I have, and I think Charles, you just said it. Do we really think that by the time of the Star Trek universe that religion would be mostly gone? Like, is everybody in Starfleet an atheist? I would say no in real life.
It seems like they treat it as the default. I mean, it's kind of a startling. Like you had like the chapel on the original series, but they use it for like when someone died or someone's getting married. You don't see like a religious ceremony going on.
Right.
Whereas you have like the Bajoran temple on DS9, which is explicitly for that religion, and that's what it's for. But as far as Starfleet characters go, I mean, you really don't have that explored. Even with being a chapel, it's more like a ceremonial place to do like chapel type activities.
Chapel stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, Nurse Chapel works there.
Yes.
One thing I would really love to see, and I've
Mhm.
thought this before, but I didn't think about bringing it up until you just mentioned this. I would love to see on one of our ensemble casts for a Star
Mhm.
Trek show, a chaplain being one of the main characters, or
Yeah.
at least a heavy recurring character, to see whether that person has their own belief system. And if they do, they obviously have to be educated in lots of other different perspectives, because they have to minister to different people of different faiths. And I would really love to see that kind of character. Who is it just an intellectual pursuit for that person? Is that person a believer themselves and appreciates belief of whatever nature it comes in? I would love to see that explored.
That would I
I
okay,
would too.
so I'm really against religion in general, just because a lot of religious people tend to be crazy psychos that want to kill everyone. That doesn't believe like they do, or it doesn't look like them. But I think that would be really fascinating.
I do too.
I'd love to see that.
I would too. I
I
don't
would love
think
to
that's a
see
great
episodes
idea.
where that character has a crisis of faith about something. I don't know. I just think that it would be a really interesting area that they've never explored before.
Well,
And-
I mean, religion has been a big part of human history for as
Yeah.
long as there's been
Mhm.
human history for a reason. So
Mhm.
I think that it's,
Yeah.
it's certainly ripe for exploration in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Alan makes a good point about the chaplain, because we know in our real life militaries there's chaplains, and as we
Yes.
here in 2025. So I think that would be very interesting.
It's just as, to me, it's just as, quote unquote, revolutionary as the
Mhm.
idea of building into the Next Generation cast a counselor.
Mhm.
That's not something that you would have thought of doing in the 60s,
Right.
And so coming into that with a counselor as one of your main characters now, arguably they never used her in the way that they should have used her. On rare occasions did you actually see her counsel.
Mhm.
But I would love to see that kind of chaplain character, a Deanna Troi type of character that is a chaplain, and you actually see them doing their job, not like sitting on the bridge and saying, "Captain, I sense betrayal," or whatever.
But I would like for the chaplain to be like an expert in all the religions, but
Yes.
be
Yes,
themselves
all the
but
religions.
Yeah.
themselves are an atheist.
Yes.
I think that would be hilarious that they're just
Yes.
well, this religion says this,
See, that is so funny, because I would write the chaplain exactly opposite. I'd write the chaplain as a truly religious person who's open-minded.
That's exactly what I would do as well.
Before we close this out, though, I have a real quick story I wanted to tell.
Uh-huh.
One time when I was like 11 years old, somewhere around there, I used to spend time at my grandmother's house, and she used to do the not New York Times, but like the newspaper crossword puzzles. So one time she asked me, because I like Star Trek, and the question was a 5-letter word for chapel in Star Trek. And then she's trying to explain to me what a chapel is. It's like a church, and I just went, nurse.
Nurse.
Yes.
Hello, nurse.
Right.
That's a good one.
All right, I think we're out of time.
Wow. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah,
We can't go another hour, because I think we could.
Yeah,
Yes.
glad we
Easily
solved
could.
that. Well, Alan, where can people find more of you?
CosmicCreative.com, KOZMIC Creative.com. Check out my other podcasts, one of which is Doctor Who A to Z, and we're currently reviewing every new episode of the current season, which has been really good and really interesting episodes, and we've had some great discussions about it. And Modern Musicology, we've got some good interviews coming up, one about The Clash. We have some other authors that we've interviewed lately, and coming up, we did our episode reviewing the music of 1975 a few weeks back, and we've got our 1985 episode coming up later this month, I think it is.
You just skipped 10 years right there.
Well, we're doing anniversary years.
Yeah, this is 2025.
Oh, yeah. So every year we do like a 70 whatever, 80, and a 90 whatever.
Okay.
Wow.
You can tell I don't listen to that very well.
I just looked up the
Well,
songs.
you're right.
I just looked up the songs in 1975. Rhinestone Cowboy by Glenn Campbell.
That's right.
Wow.
All right, Keith, where can people find more of you?
You can find me on Facebook, primarily the ESO Network Facebook groups.
And how about us, Veronica?
Feltnerdy.com.
That's right. And we've got adult show coming up. We're going to be hosting the Puppet Slam at Frolicon, where we're bringing together some of our favorite underground puppeteers from the Atlanta area to do some weird and dirty stuff at Frolicon. And then we have some family-friendly stuff coming up as well that we'll be announcing soon. So follow Felt Nerdy or Felt Nerdy and Dirty. And where else can people find us, Veronica?
Monkeying Around, a podcast about the monkeys.
That's right. We've got some fun episodes coming up. We've been teasing for a while now, but it's time for them now with Dino from the New Monkeys. And he was a hoot. So we had a great time talking to him. All right. And do you have a closing for us this week?
Watch Stargate if you want to learn about religion.
Okay. I put 2 in the chat if you want to reference one of those.
Uh-oh.
I didn't see anything in the chat.
We're on the wrong chat.
Way of the Prophets.
The Walk.
Joel on True.
There you go.
I think it's supposed to be Walk with the Prophets.
Oh.
Oh, did I spell it wrong?
Well, you put like the yeah.
Thank you for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern, talking about a legacy Star Trek topic, or you can find us on your favorite podcast platform.
I drink tequila.
Thank you. Vaya con Dios.
My darling.